This is the story of the 5th of December 1990, a day later known to CBC employees as Black Wednesday. In the 1980s, Canada was governed by a progressive conservative government headed by Brian Mulroney. This government shared a belief in neoliberal economics with the likes of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and American President Ronald Reagan. The Mulroney government changed the fabric of Canadian culture and society through deep and broad cuts to government-funded programs and institutions. The Progressive Conservative Party was eventually decimated at the 1993 election, going from 156 seats in the Parliament before the election to only 2 afterward, but its legacy of deep cuts continues to affect many parts of national life in Canada. After the Second World War, Canada began building a modern welfare state. Universal single-payer healthcare was gradually introduced in the 1950s and 60s, with modern, free healthcare system beginning on the 1st of July, 1967. Other government programs and services were also introduced, including nationalized rail services through Via Rail, pensions for the elderly, nationalization of Air Canada, and unemployment insurance. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC for short, was also expanded in order to promote and celebrate Canada's rapidly emerging distinct national character. The CBC was created in 1932 when its predecessor, the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, was established. In 1936, the broadcaster was reorganized into a Crown Corporation modeled on the BBC in Great Britain. The CBC broadcast only on radio at first, with television services beginning on the 6th of September, 1952, in Montreal. A Toronto station opened a few days later. CBC television rapidly expanded across the country in the following years, and in the 1980s, the CBC provided locally produced television newscasts and programming in many mid to large Canadian cities.
The County of Cape Breton wants Fort Petrie and the South Bar Battery blown up. The Society wants them preserved as historic monuments and tourist attractions. Joan Weeks has the story.
The Progressive Conservative government had been cutting spending throughout the 1980s, but the cuts of 1989 and 1990 were very deep indeed. The Canadian economy was sinking into recession. Many Canadians disagreed with the cuts, which directly impacted the availability of government services to smaller Canadian cities. Local CBC stations covered the reaction to the cuts, as shown in this promo from CBC Cape Breton in Sydney, Nova Scotia, discussing cuts to the government-owned Via Rail service.
Hello, I'm Joella Folds. DevCo's under pressure to bring down absenteeism at Lingan Mine. Monday on Information Morning, we'll find out what the union plans to do about it. We'll be keeping you informed on what happens at the rally to save Via Rail on Sunday, and we'll hear the recollections of 2 Cape Bretoners who remember the 1929 earthquake. So start your week with us on Information Morning. That's Hal Higgins, Glenn Billaway, and me from 6 to 9 on CBC Cape Breton.
Ironically, further cuts would result in the closure of the CBC television station in Cape Breton within a year. Then CBC President Gérard Veilleux addressed CBC employees across the country by closed-circuit video link, announcing far-reaching cuts. Employees knew the cuts were coming, but no one expected the breadth or depth of the cuts that were announced that Wednesday. The cuts were compounded by the significant drop in advertising revenue experienced by the CBC as advertisers cut spending in response to the ongoing recession. Unlike the BBC in Great Britain and the ABC in Australia, the CBC relies on advertising revenue from its television services.
Good evening. At CBC stations right across the country today, you could have heard a pin drop. Employees listening solemnly to a closed-circuit address from Corporation President Gérard Veilleux, an address reported to contain the biggest cuts ever to Canadian public broadcasting. It did. They cost in program terms, in human terms. 1,100 jobs will be lost. 11 stations will either close entirely or be pared to the bone. Depending on where you live, your local CBC outlet may already be gone, replaced by a regional service. Here's a quick look at where that's happening. On the East Coast, 3 stations, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, Labrador's Goose Bay, all effectively gone in terms of local programming. In Quebec, 3 French stations, Sept-Îles, Rimouski, and Matin, shut down or all but. In Ontario, the Windsor operation cut by 80%, and Toronto left with only a regional newscast. Viewers in Saskatchewan lost the Saskatoon news broadcast today. For those in Alberta, the Calgary program is no more. Even at stations that weren't shut down, things may never be the same. In Vancouver, for example, 50 positions will be cut. And right across the country, local non-news programming is ending. Bayeux says he has no choice because the CBC has to save $108 million. But the decision will cost a lot of jobs, and for some, it was unbelievable news.
11 television stations were either closed or reduced to a news bureau, and 1,100 people lost their jobs on that cold December day. Program cancellations and station closures took immediate effect as part of a plan by CBC management to ensure there were no emotional outbursts on air.
We were history as of last night. We didn't know it.
Tragic irony saw ads and promos for cancelled CBC programs broadcast during commercial breaks, including the award-winning local program Monitor in Toronto, which had won a Canadian Television Award at the annual Gemini Awards only the night before its cancellation.
I'm Hillary Brown in Toronto. Welcome to our new viewers in Windsor. The CBC has suffered the biggest cuts in its history. 10 local television stations are closing, some like Windsor as of tonight. At least 1,100 people are losing their jobs. All local current affairs and special programs have been eliminated effective immediately. CBC at 6 will be altered to cover news from Southern Ontario. A bureau will remain open in Windsor. The massive cuts were announced today to all employees.
As of tonight, 10 regional stations cease production. The CBC will retain just one local TV news outlet in most provinces, which will be seen province-wide. As a viewer, here's what you can expect. In Alberta, Calgary's newscast will be axed and will be replaced by a province-wide show from Edmonton. CBC Saskatoon will lose its local news. It will be replaced by a newscast originating from Regina. In Ontario, Windsor will also lose its local newscast, and in Toronto, the station will close, but there will continue to be a Toronto local newscast administered by the network. But the French service will lose its outlet in Toronto. In Montreal and Quebec City, 2 local TV operations will be maintained, but in Sept-Îles, Matane, and Rimouski, they will be chopped. Local TV production will be chopped in Sydney, Nova Scotia, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and Goose Bay, Labrador.
From CBC Ottawa, this is Newsday.
In the local stations that keep their newscasts, like CBOT in Ottawa, all local programs will be cut.
Other employees demanded to know why the cuts were not delayed to allow programs midway through their season to broadcast already taped episodes. In the Canadian Parliament, the opposition demanded answers from the government. They said that such deep and broad cuts to the CBC would threaten Canadian unity.
If he believes in the unity of this country, will his government give the CBC today the money required to maintain these vital services it's cutting?
I wonder if he can explain how the closure of regional stations in Corner Brook, Goose Bay, Sydney, Sept-Îles, Toronto, Saskatoon, and Windsor, as well as other areas, will help the CBC to fulfill its mandate and its role as the heartbeat of Canada.
Prime Minister Brian Mulroney said the CBC was not special and had to live with the consequences of present economic conditions.
Every year since this government has been here, we have given more money on a yearly basis to the CBC. We have proceeded with the construction of a headquarters in Toronto. We have authorized the creation of News World. That the CBC or any other government agency cannot function in isolation. We're all in this together, and we all must control expenditures so as to strengthen the economy in the longer haul.
Meanwhile, the mayor of Windsor, Ontario, Canada's most southerly major city just a few hundred meters across the river from downtown Detroit, said the Canadian government was abandoning southern Ontario.
And southern Canada, because there is no way that our community has any lifeline to Canadian culture anymore.
And trade union leaders said they intended to fight back, though to little avail in places such as Sydney, Cape Breton.
But there is talk in places such as Sydney of a movement to fight back.
I think the federal politicians don't need another front to start fighting on. So I think that there is enough support here that can be garnered and turned against the politicians so that they can change their mind.
But by showtime tonight, the halls at the CBC were nearly empty.
Even the station identifiers used before and after Black Wednesday reflected the end of local CBC television content. CBC television was identified either regionally or nationally, never locally. This was the local CBC ident in Cape Breton before the cuts.
We are CBC Cape Breton.
And this was the ident after the cuts.
You're watching CBC Maritime.
At the time of the 1990 cuts, a representative for the Association of Private Broadcasters in Canada argued that the CBC should stay out of local news and have a national focus. He argued that the market should be allowed to meet the demand for local news. But the market did not fill the void left by the CBC in all places affected by the cuts. Ironically, it was the CBC's new provincial newscast in Nova Scotia that became Sydney Cape Breton's most local television news service. The privately owned ATV, now CTV Atlantic, cancelled its Sydney newscast and amalgamated it into a regional newscast serving all 3 maritime provinces. Sydney Cape Breton once had 2 local newscasts, but now only had access to either a provincial or regional newscast, with no guarantee that either would feature stories from Cape Breton Island. Today, truly local news is only found in the Tuesday to Saturday newspaper or on one of the local radio stations in Cape Breton, and the level of press scrutiny of local governments, officials, and organizations is significantly reduced. A reporter from CBC Cape Breton compared the Black Wednesday cuts to the Via Rail cuts, which saw Cape Breton lose its Via Rail service in 1990.
Linda Kelly and Jim Nunn, Nova Scotians who deliver the news about their province every weeknight at 6 on CBC television. Nova Scotia News comes first on First Edition.
Well, just feel exactly the same way. This is a very special and unusual area of Canada. It's about as different from Halifax as it could be. It might as well be on different planets, the city of Sydney and the city of Halifax, and the notion that we can be served by a regional program from there is just false.
We've been through cuts, constant cuts here for the last, well, since 1985. A lot of people have gone. I think, I understand that argument, certainly initially when these cuts started, but I don't understand it anymore.
Next thing, they'll be hauling the gear out of here. It's just like tearing up the Via tracks. They're just going to try and prevent the public from supporting us, and it really makes me mad that we can't say goodbye.
The gear would eventually be hauled out of CBC in Sydney Cape Breton, with the analog transmitter being turned off in 2012. Cape Breton lost its local news program in 1990 and lost CBC television altogether in 2012 when government cuts meant the CBC could not afford to replace the old analog transmitter with a new digital one. Some of the stations closed in the Black Wednesday cuts were eventually reopened, albeit at a smaller scale. The CBC station in Windsor, Ontario was home to an experimental local news service with significantly reduced staffing levels. The success of the experiment led to the revival of other local programming across the country in cities affected by the Black Wednesday cuts. But not all stations resumed operation, and it can be argued that CBC television never fully recovered from the cuts of 1990. The CBC of today is smaller than the CBC before the Black Wednesday cuts, and Canadian culture is likely less distinct as a result. Local CBC programming never resumed on the same scale as before 1990, although regional programming did make a comeback. CBC Radio was largely untouched by the 1990 cuts, but the corporation as a whole shrank during subsequent cuts under both Liberal and Conservative governments. The current Canadian government under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has increased funding to the CBC and has floated the idea of lessening the CBC's reliance on advertising revenue, whilst the Conservative opposition want to decrease funding to the CBC. One former leader of the Tories went so far as to propose defunding the CBC altogether. For now, the future of the CBC looks bright under the current government, but the cuts of Black Wednesday continue to leave their mark.